you ever wished that you were so wide that you needed to turn sideways to fit through doorways? Well, if you have, then you come to the right place because today we're going to talk about how to grow a big and wide back. There are many different muscles in the back that we need to train in order to facilitate the best overall back development, but let's start with everyone's favorite, the lats. The lats, or latissimus dorsi muscle for you anatomy nerds out there, performs many actions, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on shoulder extension, or moving the upper arm backwards, and shoulder adduction, which is when you move your upper arm closer to the midline of the body in the frontal plane, as you see here. So any exercise that loads these movement patterns is going to be good for stimulating lat growth. The lats actually have three distinct divisions based upon where the muscle fibers originate, and these distinct parts are the thoracic division, originating from the thoracic spine, the lumbar division, originating from the lumbar spine, and the iliac division, originating from the iliac crest of the pelvis. There is some data to suggest that altering the angle from which you are pulling can bias each region of the lats, which makes sense given that some fibers of the lat are more horizontally oriented and others are more vertical. So while pulling in line with fiber orientation may be a viable strategy for biasing a particular region of the lats, it's not something that I think is necessary, nor is it something that I include in my own training because all divisions of the lats will be active during shoulder extension and adduction when using full range of motion. I'd also like to point out that if you don't already have a pair of Versa grips or straps, then I would suggest investing in some to really level up your back training. Straps are definitely going to be the cheaper option here, but either way, definitely invest in one of the two. Using a grip assistance device will allow you to train the muscles of the back close to failure without having to worry about your grip being a limiting factor. With that being said, let's get into the exercises I would recommend for training lats. The first exercise we will cover is going to be any vertical pulling motion, with my personal preference being the lat pull down, which can be shoulder extension or adduction depending on what kind of grip you use. You can see that a wider grip with a pronated wrist facilitates adduction, while a narrow grip with a neutral wrist facilitates extension. You can also use a supinated or underhand grip to place the lats under an even deeper stretch at the top of the movement. The lats act as internal rotators of the shoulder, so pulling with a supinated grip will force your shoulder into a more externally rotated position, thus putting a greater stretch on the lats. This variation will also include more biceps activation, so keep that in mind when writing your program. Now, you may ask, where should I pull the bar to? And my answer is, it depends. If you watched my quad training video, then you've heard me talk about the degree of angular displacement occurring at various joints during an exercise. Pulling the bar lower will cause a greater degree of angular displacement at the shoulder joint and thus force the lats to do more work, while pulling the bar to a higher point on your chest will cause more angular displacement at the elbow joint, thus increasing bicep involvement. So the reason I would typically suggest a lat pull down over other vertical pulls is because of stability. The stability that comes from bracing against the padding ensures that your lats can exhibit maximum force output, since our muscles can generate more force when our body detects a stable environment compared to an unstable one. Of course, if you don't like lat pull downs, you can certainly implement other vertical pulling movements like pull-ups or chin-ups, which are totally fine and arguably just as effective depending on the context. Feel free to use assistance as long as it still feels challenging to you. As I mentioned before, you can use a variety of different grip widths and hand placements. They will all train your lats just fine. So no variation of vertical pulling is necessarily always superior to another for lat growth, so pick the variation that allows you to feel the most tension in your lats at any given time. If you've watched any of my videos up until this point, you've heard me mention exercise freshness and staleness, and this is where you can apply that concept. When an exercise is fresh, it allows you to feel an immense amount of tension in the target muscle, in this case in the lats, but over time, as you continue to use that variation, it will get stale. You will notice that your performance begins to plateau over the course of many weeks. You no longer feel a lot of tension in the target muscle when performing the exercise. You don't get a big pump anymore, and you don't get sore, tired, or locally fatigued in the target muscle. These things would all be an indication that the variation you're using is stale and needs to be swapped out for something else. Now, you don't need to go and change your entire program here. Choosing a new variation could be something as simple as using a different cable attachment or grip width. But again, select the variation that feels best for you at that particular moment in time. More horizontally oriented pulls like rows or high rows are also great for training your lats. Just be sure that if you do choose a rowing movement as your primary lat exercise, that you keep your elbows tucked into your side when pulling. Lastly, I would also recommend incorporating a straight arm pullover, either with dumbbells, machines, or cables. This movement will better isolate the lats since the shoulder joint is the only one moving. My personal preference is to use a cable, lean forward, and stagger my feet. By leaning forward, I get my arm and the cable to form close to a 90-degree angle when my lats are most stretched, providing peak resistance in that stretched position. As I'm sure you've heard me say by now, this is better for muscle growth. As for staggering my feet, this enhances my stability, allowing me to produce more force. This movement will also train the long head of the triceps since it crosses the shoulder joint and acts to extend the shoulder. All right, so now that we've covered lats, let's take a look at the rest of the back. The next muscle that you're going to want to train for back growth is your traps or trapezius muscle. Now, when I say traps, most people think just of the upper traps, but the trapezius muscle is actually much larger than that and has 3 distinct divisions, with those being the upper, mid, and lower traps. You can train the upper traps with things like shrugs and full range of motion lateral raises, but I want to focus more on the mid and lower traps since most people neglect these areas. To train these areas adequately, I would suggest a horizontal pulling motion that focuses on scapular protraction and retraction. In other words, you need to let your shoulder blades come apart and get a big stretch at the bottom of the row, and then squeeze your shoulder blades together as you pull back. I feel that I'm best able to accomplish this when I use a wide grip with my wrists pronated or palms facing down. Since my elbows are more flared, the shoulder is not extending, but rather horizontally abducting, therefore decreasing lat involvement and increasing involvement of the rear delts and mid and lower trapezius. However, if you do not feel your mid-back with this variation, feel free to use whichever grip width and arm path allows you to feel the most stretch and tension in your mid-back. For the final muscle group for back training, I'm going to give an honorable mention to the spinal erectors, since having big spinal erectors can help with giving your back that really dense look. This is a group of muscles that run parallel on either side of your spine and are responsible for spinal extension. For these, I would suggest doing the deadlift or any variation of that movement. But if you want a movement that only trains the spinal erectors and nothing else, then doing something like a back extension on a machine would be better for isolation purposes. Overall, I would suggest training your back 1 to 3 times per week, depending upon how much of a weak point it may be for you. I would suggest allocating your volume to wherever you need the most improvement, with my general recommendation being between 10 and 15 sets per week of lat-specific work and 6 to 12 sets of mid-back specific work. I would recommend using lighter loads, somewhere between 30 and 70% of your 1 rep max for that particular exercise, and moderately high reps somewhere in the 10 to 30 rep range. My reasoning for this is because people tend to use momentum when pulling excessively heavy loads, so make sure you're using good technique to ensure you're actually training the muscles that you're intending to target. This recommendation does not apply to the deadlift, as I would recommend heavier loads and lower reps for that movement pattern for reasons that I discuss in my hamstring training video, so give that one a listen if you haven't already. As always, train close to failure and keep a training log to ensure your performance is improving, adding sets, reps, load, or some combination thereof over time, and you're on your way to having to turn sideways to fit through doorways. Enjoy the gains.